The first sound Wren Callister heard that morning was not the wind. It was her own stomach, a sharp, hollow contraction that pulled her out of sleep before the sky outside the loft window had committed to any particular color. She lay still on the cot with her eyes open, listening to the house below her. The stove had not been lit yet. The floorboards were silent. But underneath that silence just barely came the scratch of a pencil moving across paper at the kitchen table, slow and uninterrupted the sound of arithmetic being completed rather than attempted. She had heard her father write. Callum Callister wrote in starts and stops, the pencil moving in short bursts between long pauses, where he stared at whatever he was working on with the particular expression of a man who trusted his hands more than his head, but kept trying with both. This pencil below her moved without pausing. It had already decided where it was going. She dressed in the dark, lacing her boots by feel pulling on the extra wool undershirt she kept folded at the foot of the cot when October arrived. The window above her showed the Ashen Creek Valley in pre-dawn gray, the mountains to the north cut from a sky that was not yet fully committed to morning. Below the window, Copperbell was the size of a man's palm, spread flat the main road, with its 8 buildings, the livery at the south end, where a single lamp already burned 3 chimneys, exhaling thin white smoke that the wind bent east. People were starting fires. Kettles were being lifted. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning was running itself as it would continue to do, without requiring anything in particular from Wren Callister. She came down the loft ladder, carefully avoiding the 3rd rung, which she had learned in her first week in this house to treat gently, because Denton Harp slept light and woke irritable. But Denton was not asleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open before him, a single tallow candle throwing unsteady light across the columns. He did not look up when her boots reached the floor. Her mother stood at the stove with her back to the room, a wooden spoon turning in a pot that held something thin, not enough of whatever it was Wren registered to be the whole breakfast. Cora Callister had a way of holding her shoulders when she had already been through something and come out the other side of it that was distinct from any other posture she wore. Her shoulders said, "I have already cried. I have already decided. Do not ask me to go back." Those shoulders were up now. On the far edge of the kitchen table, set at an angle that was too deliberate to be accidental, lay a single piece of paper folded once. It had been torn from a sheet separate from the ledger, which meant it had been prepared in advance, which meant the conversation Wren was about to have was not a conversation at all, but a notification. She crossed to the stove, filled the tin cup from the shelf. Her shelf, the second one where she had kept her cup since the day she moved in, and she drank water while looking at the paper. Then she picked it up and unfolded it. Denton had a clear hand. The table he had drawn was clean columns across the top for flour, salted pork potatoes, lamp oil, firewood, and blankets. Rows down the left side marking weeks from October to April. Each cell held a number. At the bottom of the table, a single line of text in his precise accounting script. 6 months. What 4 people require is what 5 people cannot sustain. She read it through once, then she read it through again, not because she had misunderstood it, but because her mind was doing the thing it did. When presented with an unpleasant conclusion, it went back to the beginning, looking for the error that would change the outcome. There was no error. The numbers were correct. She had been helping Cora manage the household stores since August, and she knew the inventory as well as Denton did, possibly better, and the numbers were correct. 4 people. Denton, Cora, the 2 boys, Denton's nephews from Cheyenne, 9 and 11, who had come in August when their father fell ill and were not expected to leave before spring. Wren made 5. Denton set the pencil down. He closed the ledger, not quickly, with the deliberate motion of a man finishing a task rather than abandoning one. He stood straight in the vest he wore even at home and looked at her for the first time. His eyes were pale, limestone-colored creek water over rock. There was nothing vicious in them. That was the thing about Denton Harp that had always made it difficult to build a clean dislike of him. He was not a cruel man. He was a precise one. He believed in the authority of numbers the way some men believed in Scripture. The numbers had told him something, and he had acted on what they told him, and he appeared to experience no conflict between that action and anything he considered himself to be. "That paper is for you." He nodded at it in her hand. Wren looked at her mother's back. The spoon moved in the pot. Around. Around. She waited for the spoon to stop, for the shoulders to change, for some movement that would indicate that Cora was about to turn around. The spoon kept moving. "There's a canvas bag in the loft." Cora's voice was controlled in the particular way voices are controlled when the person speaking them has been rehearsing. Behind the winter box, dried apple, flour for 2 weeks, the gray blanket, your father's coat, the pot, the spoon, around and around. Wren stood with the folded paper in her hand and understood something worse than the table of numbers. The bag in the loft had not been packed this morning. It had not been packed in the hour since Denton placed his paper on the table. The dried apple, the flour measured into a cloth sack, the careful folding of Callum Callister's coat, that was the work of days, not hours. Cora had known. Not suspected, not feared known, with enough certainty and enough time to prepare her daughter's departure, the way a person packs for a journey they have accepted without finding a way to prevent. There was love in the packing. That was the part that was hardest to hold. The bag was packed with love, which meant Cora had chosen to express her love in the preparation of her daughter's exile rather than in the prevention of it, because prevention would have required something Cora did not have or could not locate. Wren set the paper back on the table. She placed it gently aligned with the table's edge. She did not look at Denton again. She went up the loft ladder, not worrying about the third rung now, and she packed the 2 canvas bags she owned, adding to what Cora had set aside the sharpening stone that had been her father's 3 books from the shelf beside the window, a spare pair of wool socks, the small tin of sulfur matches she kept in the pocket of her winter skirt. She came down for the last time. She retrieved the canvas bag from behind the winter box without looking inside it, because looking inside it would mean acknowledging the care it represented, and she could not afford that particular acknowledgement right now. Callum's coat hung on the peg by the door. Brown wool, heavy brass buttons worn smooth on the left side where his thumb had passed over them during a habit he had never explained. It smelled of coal dust in a way that years of washing had never fully answered. She put it on. It reached her knees. The shoulders hung wide. She stood at the door for a moment. Denton had returned to the ledger, not pretending to work, actually working, because the matter was concluded and there was no reason for him to do otherwise. She waited for Cora to turn around. She waited long enough to be certain the waiting was finished. The spoon moved, the shoulders held. Wren opened the door. The latch caught behind her with an ordinary sound. The sound a latch makes 10,000 times in its life. A sound built for routine, for coming back. She walked out into the gray Wyoming morning, carrying everything she owned in 3 bags, and her dead father's coat, and the town of Copperbell lay before her in the early light, looking exactly like a place that had no particular room for her, which it turned out was the case. The first night she spent in an equipment shed at the south edge of the wagon road where it curved toward Ashen Creek. The shed had no door. The frame was there, the hinges, but the door itself had been removed or had fallen. The gap faced west into the prevailing wind, which was a structural problem she addressed by stacking the broken lumber she found inside against the opening until the gap was reduced to something she could crouch behind. The fire she built in the corner was small because she had to be careful with the wood scraps she found on the floor, and small fires in large spaces with gaps in the walls are exercises in diminishing returns. By midnight, the fire was gone. By 2 in the morning, she was walking circles in the dark to keep her blood from settling. The second night was under a farm wagon left in a field east of town, its owner apparently done with it until spring. The ground was frozen. Not the light frost that appeared on surfaces and melted by 10 o'clock. True frozen ground, the kind that has given up the last of its warmth for the season. She lay on it with the bags pressed against her stomach and the gray blanket pulled to her chin, and she understood with the specific clarity that comes from direct physical experience that the distance between cold and dead was not a chasm, but a slope. She tried the farmhouses, 3 of them spread across 2 days. The first woman who answered her door looked at Wren with an expression that held real sorrow, the kind that comes from recognizing a situation that reflects poorly on the whole arrangement of things. And she said she was sorry, truly she was, but they were already managing thin. The second farmer spoke through a door he did not open all the way and said he had enough mouths. At the third house, she knocked twice, heard movement inside a chair, scraping footsteps, crossing a floor, then silence, more silence, and finally nothing. She walked back toward town after the third door. She was not angry. Anger requires a theory of injustice, requires believing that things should be otherwise. And she was currently engaged in the more urgent project of believing that she would still be alive in a week, which left limited capacity for other beliefs. She found the root cellar behind the burned homestead, half a mile north of the wagon road on the fourth night. The burned structure above it was long cold. Its timbers collapsed into a shape that looked from a distance like a pile of dark snow. But the cellar door was intact, its wooden handles still sound, and below it the temperature was warmer than open air by enough to matter. Something in the back corner smelled of rot she could not identify in the dark, but she did not go to the back corner. She ate a piece of dried apple from the bag Cora had packed and sat with her back against the earthen wall and thought about what she was going to do. She returned to Copperbell the fifth morning because she was out of options for pretending she did not have to. The supply store on the main road kept a wooden bin outside the door where the storekeeper left spoiled or damaged goods for whoever needed them. Slightly soft potatoes flour that had gotten wet vegetables past their best. She filled her coat pockets from the bin and ate standing in the alley beside the store raw potato pieces, chewing methodically, not thinking about how it tasted because taste was not the relevant metric. Silas Mott was across the street. He stood in the doorway of his forge in his leather apron, with his arms folded, watching her with an expression she could not read cleanly from that distance. Not hostile, something more complicated. She turned away before he could decide whether to speak because she was not in a position to have a conversation that required her to manage someone else's discomfort on top of her own. On the fifth morning, she was standing in the middle of the wagon road watching snow fall onto Callum's coat when she realized she had been standing there for longer than she could account for. She did not know when she had stopped walking. The snowflakes were melting as they hit the wool one, then the next. Small dark spots appearing and disappearing, and her mind was moving very slowly through something that did not resolve into a thought. Her father's voice arrived then, not retrieved but delivered the way cold comes. "The earth doesn't care about your feelings, Wren. You have to learn its language." He had said it at the kitchen table one evening while he repaired a pick handle, the lamp burning low, his hands working without hurrying. He meant the rock underground, the way you had to read the seams and the moisture patterns and the small sounds a shaft made when it was unhappy before you trusted your weight to it. He had not intended it as advice for standing in a road while snow fell and one's mind quietly proposed shutting down. She took it as advice for standing in a road while snow fell. She started walking uphill into the pine-covered slope above the creek because she needed firewood, and because the act of walking was itself a decision, and a decision was the thing that separated a person from the road they were standing on. She collected dead branches as she went, tucking them under her arm, building the load slowly. The pines thinned above the first ridge, and the limestone showed itself between trees gray-brown and seamed, and the air up here was colder but cleaner. She was following a deer trail packed earth narrow efficient because animals had no patience for scenic routes. The trail curved around a limestone outcropping, dropped into a hollow, then climbed again toward a rock face that rose 20 feet before angling east. She nearly walked past it. The crack in the rock face was not obvious. A vertical seam 4 feet wide at the base, hidden by a scrub juniper that had grown flush against the stone over what must have been decades. The deer trail ended directly in front of it. Not near it directly in front, as if the trail's destination had always been this point in the rock. She stepped through the juniper branches, catching on the coat's shoulders, and stood before the opening. The air was different here. Not warmer, the distinction she reached for was steadiness. The wind that had been working at her for an hour was simply gone, replaced by a stillness that moved outward from the crack, like breath from something much larger and much calmer than she was. She found the candle stub in her smaller bag. One of her 4 remaining matches lit it on the first strike. She turned sideways and pushed into the crack. 10 feet of passage stone pressing both shoulders, and then the passage released her into the chamber. She stopped. The ceiling was high enough to stand beneath without stooping. The floor was flat stone, dry clean in the way limestone gets when water abandoned it long enough ago that the memory of moisture is gone from the air itself. The chamber extended back into the hillside farther than her candle showed clearly. She could see the walls on either side close enough to be useful, but the rear of the space dissolved into darkness. Dry. Completely, absolutely dry. She had not understood until this moment how much of her thinking for the past 5 days had been organized around the concept of wet around, avoiding it, mitigating it, surviving it. The dryness of this chamber was a physical relief that moved through her like something released. She turned the candle left. Fire pit. Not a natural depression in the rock, deliberate the stones around its rim, placed with care, blackened by long use. Above it, a crack in the ceiling angled upward at a pitch that would carry smoke out through the rock face above. Someone had either found that crack by luck or understood geology well enough to know where to look. Either way, someone had understood that a fire in an enclosed space is useful only if the smoke has somewhere to go. She moved the candle slowly around the chamber. Old gray firewood stacked against one wall, solid under her hand, though it had been here long enough to lose any smell of resin. A coil of rope on a natural rock shelf. Two tin cans, their labels long gone. A blanket so faded and dust-covered it had taken on the coloring of the stone it rested on. Near the entrance passage, someone had built a low deflection wall from flat rocks stacked without mortar, but stacked with enough care that they had held, which spoke of patience and understanding of how wind moves through narrow spaces. She stood in the center of the chamber and breathed. The air tasted of cold stone and old ash and nothing else. No rot, no dampness, no the smell of failure that the root cellar had carried. Something in her chest, which had been compressed into a tight configuration for 5 days, shifted by a fraction. Not hope was a thing she had decided to defer until she could afford it. Something more like a compass needle settling after being moved away from north. A sense of direction reasserting itself. Then the candlelight found the far wall. She crossed the chamber slowly. The marks began at shoulder height, running downward in careful vertical lines grouped in sets of 5. The way marks are made by people who know they need to count over time. She ran her fingertips across the first row. 20 marks. 40. She stepped sideways. 100. 200. The marks covered a section of wall 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, uniform in depth, scratched with something narrow. A nail, a knife point. The consistency of the depth and spacing told her something. Whoever made these had not scratched them in a frenzy or a moment of despair. They had made them the same way every time for a very long time. She counted as carefully as the candlelight allowed. When she reached the last mark, a single vertical line in the middle of a row, no final stroke completing a group, no concluding mark of any kind, her total was somewhere above 400. 14 months. More than 14 months of daily marks on a cave wall in the hills above Copperbell, Wyoming, a cave that apparently nobody in the town below had known existed. The single unfinished line held her attention longer than the total did. A mark that stopped mid-count was not the mark of someone who died. People who died in the middle of a task left the evidence of interrupted activity, objects, out-of-place tasks, half completed the disorganization of a life cut off. This cave was orderly. The wood was stacked, the rope was coiled. The wall itself had been chosen and used with intention over more than a year. This was not the mark of someone who had run out of days. This was the mark of someone who had, on a specific day, simply stopped making marks, who had decided or been compelled by something other than death to be somewhere else. The candle was burning low. She looked around the chamber one more time, the fire pit, the dry wood, the rope, the stacked flat rock deflection wall, the high ceiling, the complete absence of wind. Then she looked at the unfinished mark on the wall, this small record of a life lived in this particular piece of stone. She did not have words for the decision that formed in her. It was below language in the part of a person that operates on pattern recognition and survival logic. But it was a decision, not a feeling, and that distinction mattered. She left before the candle died, marking the juniper outside with a cut from her knife blade, so she could find the passage at any light level. She came down the hillside with the firewood she had collected, and she re-entered Copperbell at dusk, moving with a purpose she had not carried into town since before the kitchen door closed behind her. She was back at the cave before sunrise the next morning, carrying 22 pounds of potatoes in the heavy canvas bag purchased at the supply store, with coins she had kept sewn into the hem of her spare skirt since the week after her father's funeral. Callum had believed in keeping something back. Not much. Enough to mean something when everything else was spoken for. She stacked the potatoes against the rear wall of the chamber where the temperature was lowest, and most consistent, loose enough for air to circulate, dense enough to allow early inspection for rot. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had. 22 pounds of potatoes, a stub of tallow candle, 4 matches, a sharpening stone, a knife, a gray blanket, a coat that had once belonged to a man who understood the earth's language. She made a list in the dirt with her finger flour, Salt pork, dried beans, more firewood cut to length, a proper tin for cooking lamp oil, or tallow a hatchet rope, additional blankets. She smoothed it away with her boot not to hide it, but because she had memorized it in the writing. She spent the rest of that day hauling. Down to town, up to the cave, down again. She improvised a sled from a board she found behind the mill waste pile, 2 lengths of twine knotted through holes she punched with her knife point, and she used it for loads too heavy to carry against her body. The slope was steep enough that the third trip left her shoulders aching in a sustained, low way that she stopped registering as information once it became clear it was not going to worsen. Pain that was not dangerous was just the price of useful work. Silas Mott saw her on the second afternoon of hauling from the doorway of his forge. She was crossing the main road with the sled loaded, moving at the pace the slope demanded. His voice carried across the road with the easy projection of a man who had spent decades talking over forge noise. "What in creation are you dragging up that hill every day?" She kept her eyes on the grade ahead. Supplies. For what? She glanced north. The mountains had been wearing a cap cloud for 4 days, not the low-moving gray of ordinary weather, but the stationary white pile that sat above the peaks when serious cold was building on the other side of them. Winter. His laugh came out easy without malice. "Winter's not here yet, girl." "No." She pulled the sled up onto the slope. "That's why I'm not waiting for it." She heard him say something to someone behind him in the forge. She could not make out the words, but the tone was the tone of a man sharing an amusement. The sound of it went with her up the hill, and she let it go because laughter required a response only from people who needed something from the one laughing. Over the days that followed, Stone Cradle changed. She built shelves from salvaged boards angled so supplies sat off the floor where moisture could eventually climb. She raised her blanket bedding on a frame of branches 6 inches above the stone because the cold that lived in the rock at floor level was a different animal than the cold in the air above it. She packed clay from the creek bank 2 miles down, mixed it with pine needles and forced it into the gaps of the entrance passage, tamping it hard and leaving it to cure until the wind that had once moved through the passage reduced itself to nothing. She stopped carrying a lantern on the climb from town. She had made the trip enough times that her feet knew where the loose shale started, where the juniper marked the passage entrance, even at full dark. On a cold Thursday morning, 11 days after first entering the cave, she came down the hill at first light and stopped at the tree line. A rabbit hung from the pine at the slope's base, freshly caught, still warm, strung by the hind legs with wire. Below the tree in the frost crust, boot prints large, longer than her foot by several inches, carrying the slight inward angle of someone accustomed to uneven ground. The prints came from the east, stopped at the tree, returned east. She looked at the prints for a long time. She was not afraid, which she found slightly surprising, given that someone had been watching her route closely enough to know where she passed each morning. But threat did not feed you, and this had fed her, and she had developed a direct and practical relationship with the question of what fed her. She took the rabbit, carried it to the cave, cleaned it over the secondary pit with the efficiency of a girl who had been doing that work since she was 9, roasted it on a green stick spit, ate it without ceremony. While it cooked, she sat against the wall below the marks 14 months of someone else's careful daily accounting, ending in a line that had stopped without explanation. Not dead, she thought again, looking at the orderly chamber. Someone who had lived here with complete seriousness for more than a year, and then one day had somewhere else to be. She added a piece of dry wood to the fire. Whoever you were, she thought you understood this place correctly. The weeks that followed built themselves into a rhythm she had not had since her father was alive. Purpose in the morning, physical work through the day, accounting in the evening. The cave's inventory grew. Potatoes, flour, dried beans, salt pork traded for labor at the tanner's smoked rabbit from 3 more anonymous gifts left at the pine tree. Firewood stacked floor to ceiling in the driest section, more than she had calculated needing, because Callum had said to double the firewood estimate and then add a third again. 4 blankets, a hatchet found propped against the juniper one morning, in exchange for the rabbit, its handle smooth from years of someone else's grip. Rope, tallow candles, the bone-handled knife she kept at a working edge. The mystery gifts continued with a regularity that had stopped feeling random. After the rabbit, after the hatchet, a coil of good rope appeared propped against the juniper one morning, thicker than baling wire, the kind used for heavy work. 2 days later, a bundle of dry deer hide cured and scraped the kind of material that had a dozen cold weather uses. Each item appeared at the pine tree or against the juniper in the hours before dawn, always accompanied by the same large boot prints angling in from the east, stopping, returning. Wren had developed a theory. The prints came from above the cave, not from the valley. Whoever left these things approached from the higher terrain from the ridgeline east of Stone Cradle, which meant they knew the mountain well enough to move across the upper ridge in the dark without following a trail. That was a specific kind of knowledge. It was not the knowledge of a farmer or a shopkeeper. It was the knowledge of someone who had spent serious time on this particular piece of ground. She thought about the marks on the cave wall, 14 months of daily accounting ending in a line that had stopped mid-count. Someone who had lived in Stone Cradle long enough to understand its structure, its airflow, its position relative to the ridgeline. Someone who would know exactly what a person trying to survive a Wyoming winter in that cave would need, and when they would need it. She left a piece of smoked rabbit on the pine branch one morning. It was gone the next day. She felt the boot prints in the dark with her fingers. The same man. He had come, taken the meat, left nothing in return. Just taken it, which was its own form of communication, an acknowledgement, not quite an acceptance from someone who was not yet ready to be found. She went to Bess Holloway's diner on a morning in the third week. The diner was where most of Copperbell gathered before the working day took hold of them. Farmers, mill workers, the men from the assay office. Bess's coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. When Wren pushed the door open, the conversation in the room did the thing. Conversation does when a person enters whose presence makes the room briefly uncertain about itself. She stood near the door with snow on the shoulders of Callum's coat. She spoke clearly without preface because preface was a way of softening a thing so people could dismiss it gently rather than confront it directly. There is a serious storm building, more serious than people are assuming. You need more food in your cellars. You need more firewood than you have. The room considered this. Amos Greer, whose farm sat at the creek's bend, made a sound through his teeth. Two men near the window exchanged looks that carried the weight of shared amusement. Someone toward the back of the room said the cave girl had taken up weather forecasting. Scattered laughter. She looked at the room, not with anger, not with the particular brittleness of someone who needs to be taken seriously. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at the northern sky each morning, reading what was actually there, rather than what she preferred to find. She saw certainty everywhere, the deep weathered certainty of people who had been right about ordinary winters long enough to believe this winter was ordinary. Denton Harp sat at a table in the far corner. He had a coffee cup in front of him. He was not drinking from it. He was looking at her with the careful, calculating attention he gave to a column of figures he suspected might contain an error he had not yet located. When her eyes found his, he did not look away quickly. He held her gaze for a full 2 seconds, then looked down at the cup. She turned and left. The laughter that rose behind her was not vicious. It was the comfortable laughter of people who feel insulated from the thing being described, and it was therefore the most useless sound she had ever walked away from. She climbed back toward Stone Cradle as snow began in earnest. Real snow, now the kind with weight to it, each flake distinct for a moment before joining the accumulation. The air had changed in the last 2 hours, not simply colder, but denser, as if the atmosphere was pressing itself down in preparation for something it needed more room to do. That afternoon, the morning after her second visit to the diner, Opaline Fitch appeared at her elbow outside the supply store. Opal Fitch was 70 years old and moved as though the cold had long since lost the ability to surprise her. She was wrapped in layers of wool that had no particular color anymore, having faded through enough winters to achieve a gray that was close to the gray of the limestone hills. Her eyes were sharp in the way eyes get when everything else has slowed, not diminished. Concentrated the accumulated attention of a woman who had been watching Wyoming for decades. She stood beside Wren and looked at the sky to the north for a long moment without speaking. Then her voice came quiet but certain. Big storm coming. Wren kept her hands on the sled knots. How big? Opal's face did something that was not quite a frown, more the expression of a person doing arithmetic in their head that they would prefer to come out differently. Bigger than most folks in this town realize. She said nothing else. She did not offer advice or elaboration. She simply stood there for another moment, looking north, then turned and walked back along the road, with the measured pace of a woman who had decided how much urgency the situation warranted. Wren watched her go. The words stayed with her the way certain words do not, because they were new information, but because they were the first confirmation she had received from someone who had no reason to offer false comfort. She doubled the firewood that night. The next day she doubled it again. Inside the cave, she fed the main fire 3 pieces of dry hardwood and sat with her back against the wall, counting inventory, the way her father counted tunnel timbers by hand in the dark, because the hands know what the eyes can miss. She knew the numbers before she finished touching each item. The counting was not about information. It was about the difference between a person who knows exactly what she has and a person who is hoping she has enough. She picked up the almanac she had carried from the loft. She read by firelight, marking nothing since she had no pencil, committing the relevant passages to the place in her memory where useful things were filed. The Weather Patterns chapter. The section on reading cloud formations. The brief paragraph on what old-timers in the Wyoming Territory called a builder storm, a weather system that spent weeks organizing itself above the northern ranges before descending all at once, carrying more snow and wind than 3 ordinary storms combined. She set the almanac down. Outside, the first real wind of the night hit the hillside. Then it came, a sound she felt in the rock beneath her before she heard it in the air above. Low, sustained, a vibration moving through the mountains from the north like something enormous shifting its weight. Not thunder. She had checked the sky before coming inside. There was no lightning anywhere in the visible world. She rose and went to the entrance passage, pushed through into the night air, stood on the hillside. The northern horizon was gone. In its place, filling the sky from one edge of what she could see to the other, a wall of cloud rose in the darkness. Not the gray of ordinary weather cloud, but a black-green darkness that had the quality of massive density, of something that had been gathering force for a long time in a place beyond sight, and had now arrived at the limit of the visible world. It moved. She could see it moving even in the dark, the way you can see a wave moving before it reaches you, by the way the water ahead of it changes. The sound came again. The mountains took it and held it in the stone. Something tightened in Wren's chest. Not panic. She had decided weeks ago that panic was a resource she could not afford to spend. Something more specific. The sharp, clarifying sensation of understanding that the estimate she had been working from was wrong. Not wrong in its reasoning, wrong in its timeline. She had prepared for the storm to arrive in 3 or 4 days. But what she was looking at now had not come at the pace she had calculated. It had come faster. She looked at the passage behind her, at what she had carried up this hill, 1 load at a time, through laughter and cold, in 24 climbs that had left her shoulders raw, at what waited inside the stone for whatever was coming next. She went back in. She fed the fire. She pulled her bedding frame away from the wall and checked the clay-packed gaps in the passage one more time by feel-pressing each section with her thumb, looking for any place the drying had opened a crack. The clay was solid. The passage held. She lay down on the blanket frame and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the wind grew. She could hear it working across the rock face above, finding no purchase, moving on. Inside, the fire breathed its small, regular breath. People survive what they prepare for, her father had once said, turning a pick handle in the lamplight. What kills you is the thing you decided to wait on. She closed her eyes. The mountain did not move. The storm arrived after midnight with no preliminary. Wren had been asleep for 2 hours when the sound came, not gradually, not with the building quality of a storm that is announcing itself from a distance, but all at once, a roar that hit the mountain like a freighter hitting a bridge. The full and immediate weight of a weather system that had been gathering itself for weeks, unleashing everything it had stored. She was upright before she was fully awake. The fire had burned to coals in the pit. She fed it with her hands, not looking, 2 pieces of hardwood on top of the coals, and listened. Stone cradle was steady. The sound outside was extraordinary, a sustained freight train violence that moved across the hillside and across the rock face and was swallowed by the stone. Inside the chamber, the air moved in its small breathing way around the fire and did nothing else. The clay in the passage held. The deflection wall held. The sound of the storm was information, not experience, which was exactly the distinction between a shelter and an accident of geography. She sat beside the fire for an hour listening. The storm did not diminish. It found its level and held it, the particular steadiness of a system that has enough mass to sustain itself without borrowing from anything. This was not a storm that would spend itself in a night and leave clearing skies behind it. She added more wood. She slept. Morning arrived as a gray suggestion rather than an event. The light that came through the crack above the fire pit was the light of a sky completely occupied by cloud. No sun anywhere in it, which reduced dawn to a gradual brightening of darkness rather than an actual transition. Wren ate cold potato and dried apple, drank water she had kept in a tin beside the fire to prevent it freezing, put on every layer she owned, pulled Callum's coat over all of it, and pushed out through the passage. The force of the wind hit her before she cleared the juniper. Not a gust, a sustained pressure directional strong enough that she had to lean into it to stand upright. Snow came horizontally from the northwest, which meant it came into her face the moment she turned north to look at the valley. She raised her arm to shield her eyes. 20 feet of visibility. Maybe. The hillside below her was gone, not obscured by cloud or distance, physically buried the terrain she had climbed every day for weeks, transformed into an undifferentiated white surface that gave no indication of what was underneath it. The tree line had become a gray suggestion. The valley floor was invisible. Copperbell half a mile below was gone. She was turning to go back inside when she saw it. A shape, far down the slope at the edge of the tree line, where the deer trail began its open traverse across the hillside. Moving upward. Not smoothly, it moved in the lurching way of a person whose legs were failing them 3 steps forward, a stagger 4 more steps, then down. Going down. Getting up. The shape was too large to be a child, too slow to be someone in full physical function. Wren went back into the passage. She left the coat wearing it, and this Wen would be fighting a sail. The excess fabric would cost her balance on every step. She went back to the chest-high shelf where she kept the rope. The good rope, the thick coil left by the mystery benefactor, and she tied one end around her waist with the knot her father had taught her, the one that did not tighten under load. She fed the remaining coil back through the passage. Then she picked up the hatchet. She pushed back out into the storm. The wind was worse without the coat. She felt it find every gap in the wool layers, immediately pressing cold against her spine, her ribs, the back of her neck. She moved down the slope using the hatchet as a stake, driving it into the snow ahead of her, leaning on it, pulling her legs through the drifts. The rope played out behind her. She had 40 feet of it. She knew where the tree line started by the pressure change the trees made in the wind, a slight reduction in the horizontal force. She aimed for that. She found the shape 20 feet past the tree line down in a depression where the snow had filled to chest depth for a standing adult, which meant this was a hole, not open ground. Opaline Fitch lay at the bottom of it. She was alive. Her eyes were open, tracking Wren's face with the careful, slow attention of a person whose body has reduced all non-essential function to conserve what remains. Her lips had a color that was not quite gray, not quite blue, the color between those two things. Her breathing was there, shallow, each inhale a small visible effort. "I came looking." Opal's voice was a filament barely carrying over the wind. "Thought I could reach you." Wren drove the hatchet into the snow at the depression's edge and used the handle to lower herself in. The snow here was above her knees. She got her arms under Opal's arms, got the older woman upright, felt the dead weight of legs that had stopped cooperating. Opal was not heavy. She had the lightness of a woman who had never been large, reduced further by age. But dead weight at the end of a 40-foot rope on a hillside in a blizzard is a different number than dead weight in a warm room. She started up. The rope was a guide more than a lifeline. It told her where the passage was when the visibility dropped to nothing, which it did twice on the way up the wind, throwing a wall of snow so dense it had texture something close to solid. The first time the wall hit, she stopped moving and bent over Opal, covering the old woman's face with her own body and letting the worst of it pass. The second time, she was not quick enough and went to one knee, dragging Opal sideways, losing 2 feet of elevation before she could correct. Then it happened. The slope gave way beneath her left foot, not dramatically, just a pocket of unconsolidated snow over a rock edge she could not see, and she went down hard, her left side dropping into a rut in the hillside that was deeper than it looked. The snow closing over her shoulder, her face hitting the white surface, cold filling her ear and her collar simultaneously. She lost Opal's arm. She felt the rope go taut against her waist. She was in the rut to her shoulder, her left arm pinned below her, and for 10 full seconds, she could not get purchase on anything with her right hand because the surface around the rut was unconsolidated and everything she grabbed dissolved. She made herself stop moving, her father's voice not remembered but arriving. Find the solid thing first. She drove her right elbow down through the snow until it hit rock. She pushed. The rut released her slowly, the way cold things release without cooperation, without assistance, simply yielding to applied force. She came up, found Opal with her right hand, got the older woman's arm back across her shoulders. Her hands had stopped having individual fingers by the time they reached the juniper. They were functional shapes at the ends of her arms. She used them anyway. Inside the passage, the wind stopped. She got Opal through and into the chamber and down onto the blanket frame. The fire was still alive, banked but not out. She fed it. She got Opal's outer layers off. They were rigid with ice, the wool frozen into the shape of a person who had been in the wind too long. Underneath, Opal was shivering in a deep, sustained way that was encouraging because it meant her body was still fighting. Wren wrapped her in the two driest blankets and sat behind her, sharing the heat of her own body, and waited. The shivering took a long time to slow. The fire did its work. Color returned to Opal's face in the incremental way color returns to things that have been very cold first. The lips, then the nose, then the cheeks in patches. When the old woman's eyes focused with intention rather than just tracking, Wren knew the worst was past. Opal looked around Stone Cradle from the blanket frame, at the stocked shelves, at the organized firewood, at the cooking tins on their bracket, at the deflection wall at the passage entrance. She looked at all of it for a long time with the expression of a woman recalibrating an estimate she had thought was already generous. All of it. Everything you said you were doing. Her voice was still thin but had its own quality back, its own intelligence. You actually did all of it. Wren had both hands around a tin of water she was heating for Opal at the fire's edge. I said I was going to. Opal shifted slightly, testing whether her body would comply. It complied. People say things. Her eyes moved across the shelves one more time. You did things. That's not the same country. Wren handed her the tin when the water was warm enough. Opal took it with hands that shook only a little now. She drank. Outside, the storm worked across the rock face above them and found nothing to hold on to and moved on. On the second day of the storm, the first knock came. Wren heard it 2 blows against the outer rock face near the juniper. The signal she had not told anyone to use, but that a person desperate to be heard would naturally produce. She went through the passage with the lantern and pushed out into the storm, which had not relented, which showed no intention of relenting. Amos Greer stood at the juniper with his son in his arms. The boy was 6 years old. His lips were the color Opal's had been the color between blue and gray. Amos's face held something that was not expression. In the ordinary sense, it was what a face looks like when everything it used to use for expression has been repurposed for survival. He was a big man, Amos Greer, the one who had made the sound through his teeth in the diner, the one who had leaned back in his chair with comfortable certainty. He did not lean now. He stood in the blizzard with his son, and his voice came out stripped of everything except the fact, "The stove went out. I can't get it relit. The boy's going cold." Wren looked at the child. She stepped aside and pulled the juniper branch back to clear the passage entrance. "Come through." Amos brought the boy inside. The chamber took them in. The fire did its work. The boy's color changed back by degrees. The man set his son down on the blanket frame beside Opal, who took the child's hands between her own without being asked, and began the slow, practical work of warming them. Amos stood in the center of the chamber and looked at what Wren had built, saying nothing. He was a farmer. He understood stores, understood preparation, understood the relationship between work done before a crisis and capacity during one. He stood in the middle of the evidence of that relationship, and his jaw moved once without producing a sound. By nightfall of the second day, there were 7 people in Stone Cradle. A family of 3 came in the afternoon, a young couple and their infant, the husband carrying the baby inside his coat. 2 old brothers from the east side of town who had arrived together at the juniper and pushed through without waiting to be invited, which Wren decided to accept as initiative. A mill worker named Dex Pryor, who had been caught on the road between the mill and his boarding house and had climbed the hillside by instinct, following the slope up and up until the juniper appeared in front of him, like an answer he had not known he was looking for. Wren divided the space with the same logic she applied to everything practical, first then fair. The family with the infant took the warmest position closest to the main fire. Opal stayed on the blanket frame. The others arranged themselves on the stone floor with whatever insulation was available. Their own coats beneath them, the deer hide cut into strips that distributed the material as widely as possible. On the third day, Cal Briggs arrived in the morning with blood on his coat from a cut above his eye where the wind had driven ice against his face. He was a quiet man in his early 40s who fixed wagon wheels for a living and had a wife named Dottie, who was somewhere between sick and very sick with the lung trouble she had been carrying since summer. Dottie came in after Cal guided through the passage with his hand at her back, and she moved with the careful, deliberate motion of someone for whom each breath was a negotiation. Dottie went near the fire. Cal sat beside her and did not move from that position for most of the first day. That night, when Wren did the late inventory in the dark, her hands moving across each shelf by feel, she found the pork tin one portion lighter than it should have been. Not a full portion half. Enough to matter at 8 people over 6 days. She sat with that information for a moment. Then she looked at Cal, who was asleep sitting up against the wall beside his wife. His head dropped to his chest, the exhaustion of a frightened man who has kept himself upright through will for as long as will is available. She looked at Dottie, whose breathing, even in sleep, carried a wet quality that the warmth of the cave had not yet smoothed. Wren went to her own portion on the shelf. She cut it in half. She set the half beside Dottie's blanket, where Cal would find it in the morning, not on the shelf with the others, but separate, placed clearly. Then she went back to her position by the fire. Nobody was awake. Nobody saw her do it. That was not the point. On the 4th morning, the widow from the north side of town arrived with her 2 teenage sons, all 3 of them covered in snow to the chest, from forcing their way up the hillside through drifts that had closed to shoulder height. Marta Selby had been in Copperbell for 6 years. Her husband had died in the creek flood of 1880, and she had raised the boys alone on a subsistence farm without complaint or ceremony. She came through the passage and looked at the full chamber without surprise. She simply found the remaining open floor space, sat down, pulled her sons in on either side of her, then looked at Wren directly. "Tell me what you need done." Wren looked at her. "Can you cook over an open fire without wasting wood?" "Been doing it since before you were born." "Then cook." Marta Selby took over the secondary pit without requiring further instruction. She was the first person in Stone Cradle who did not need to be managed, and Wren felt the difference immediately. Not relief, but a shift in the weight she was carrying. A single person being competent without prompting changes the texture of a space. The supply store was open but quiet on what had been before the storm a regular trading morning. Wren had gone in before the worst of the second day to buy a second cooking tin, a paper sack of dried apples. She could not truly afford a coil of baling wire, 3 tallow candles. The storekeeper, a narrow man named Aldous Fenn, who wore the same canvas apron every day of his working life, regardless of season, had wrapped the items without comment. She had thought then about what Emmett Gould kept in his warehouses along the creek road. She thought about it again now on the 4th day, looking at 11 people in a cave she had stocked for one. Emmett Gould was the wealthiest man in Copperbell. He owned the general store, 3 warehouses along the creek road, a quarter share in the Ashen Creek Mill, a mortgage on the livery. He was 61 years old, broad in the shoulder, with the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had learned that the person who speaks last in any room generally ended the conversation on his own terms. In the diner before the storm, he had told the room his warehouses held enough to see Copperbell through 2 winters, back to back. He had said it with the composure of a man presenting a solution. He had not opened the warehouses. On the 5th day of the storm, Lorna Gould appeared at the Juniper. Her coat was soaked through. Ice clung to her hair at the temples. She did not bring supplies she brought herself, which Wren understood meant she had left her father's house with no intention of returning to it before this was over. She came through the passage and leaned against the wall beside the entrance with the expression of someone who has made a decision that cost them something significant and is now on the other side of the cost, past the point where it can be undone. Wren handed her a tin of warm water. Lorna took it. Then, looking at the fire rather than at Wren, she said what she had come to say. "He's locked the store, both warehouses too. He has the keys. There are families on the east side who cannot get to their own stored goods because the road is buried." She stopped. Tried again. "He said the storm was an opportunity to establish credit terms with people who had been resistant to them." Her voice was flat in the way of someone delivering a fact that discussed them too much for inflection. He said that at breakfast on the morning the storm started. I left that afternoon. It took me 2 days to find the passage up the trail was gone in the drifts. The chamber was quiet. Even the infant was quiet. He said that. Opal's voice came from the blanket frame, not a question, just the repetition a person performs when a thing needs to be heard again to be believed. Wren looked at the fire. She thought about the numbers on her shelf, 12 people now diminishing stores a storm with no visible ceiling. She thought about Emmett Gould's warehouses full of goods he had described as sufficient for 2 winters, which he had apparently decided to convert into leverage before the first winter was done. She did not say anything about it. There was nothing to say about it that the present moment could address. There's space. She looked at Lorna. Can you men sew stitch anything like that? Lorna's expression shifted, not offense, more the surprised recalibration of someone expecting a different question. Yes. One of the blankets tore at the corner last night. Find it. Wren turned back to the fire. Make it useful again. On the 6th night, Wren sat with her back against the cave wall after everyone else had gone to sleep and did the arithmetic she had been deferring for 2 days because she had not wanted the answer. 12 people. She counted the shelf by feel in the dark. Potatoes she estimated 4 days remaining at current portions. Flour perhaps 5. Dried beans 3. Salt pork 2 days if she held the current ration 3, if she reduced it. Firewood was better, she had over-prepared on wood. Callum's rule of double plus a third had served her. 6 days of fire remained even in sustained cold. But food was the harder number. 4 days of food. The storm had not indicated any intention of ending in 4 days. She did not catastrophize it, which was a discipline rather than an absence of fear. She simply held the number and thought about what it meant, what it required, what was available to respond to it. The fire in the main pit had settled to its overnight rhythm, steady and low, the kind of burn that asked for nothing and provided enough. Around it, 12 people breathed in the particular way people breathe in deep sleep. Unguarded, complete the breathing of people who feel safe enough to stop managing themselves. She picked up the almanac and opened it to the weather chapter. Builder storms in the Wyoming Territory typically ran 6 to 9 days at full intensity before beginning a reduction cycle. She was on day 6, which meant the outer edge of possible relief was tomorrow. The more probable edge was 2 days out. The realistic outer limit was 3. 4 days of food. 3 days to storm's end. It was solvable if nothing else went wrong. She closed the almanac. She added 1 piece of wood to the fire and settled back against the wall and watched the chamber in the low light. Lorna Gould had mended the torn blanket and then, without being asked, mended 2 other items she found with loose seams. Marta Selby's sons had taken over the wood management at the secondary pit without requiring direction. Cal Briggs had spent the afternoon reinforcing the deflection wall with additional stones he found loose on the chamber floor. Amos Greer, large and initially loud, had become one of the quietest people in the cave, watching things, helping when help was needed, saying very little. What she had built had become something other than what she had built it to be. On the 7th morning, Wren woke to a silence that was different in quality from the silence of the preceding nights. The wind was there, she could hear it in the rock above, but it had a different character. Not the sustained freight train roar of the first 4 days. An intermittent sound gust rather than a wall, the weather system breathing rather than screaming. She got up without disturbing anyone and went through the passage. The juniper hit her with cold air, not cold wind. She pushed through into the morning and stood on the hillside. Snow still fell, but lightly, the way it falls at the end of something rather than the middle. The sky to the north had lifted, not cleared, but lifted the ceiling higher than it had been, the black-green quality of the deep storm thinning toward ordinary gray. She could see the tree line from where she stood. She could see the valley dimly through the falling snow. Not detail, the valley was buried under what looked like 6 or 7 feet of accumulated drift in the low areas, but shaped the outline of it. The storm was winding down. She went back inside. She waited until everyone had their eyes open, until the morning sounds of 12 people adjusting to consciousness had settled. Then she spoke into the room. 2 more days, maybe less. Then we go down. Nobody celebrated. These were Wyoming people. They understood that announcing the end of a thing was different from the end of the thing. On the afternoon of the seventh day, the incident with the food happened. Wren had just finished the midday portion distribution, careful, measured, equal, when Amos stood up from his position near the secondary pit and said what he had apparently been building toward for at least a day. "My boy needs more than the rest. He's a child. Children need more." The chamber went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when a thing that has been unspoken is suddenly spoken. Wren looked at Amos. His son was across the chamber sitting with Marta Selby's boys, apparently fine, not thriving. Nobody in the cave was thriving but fine. Color in his face. Alert. He had eaten everything he was given at each meal without complaint. She did not answer immediately. She let the room hear what Amos had said in the silence that followed it. Marta Selby spoke first, her voice carrying the flat authority of a woman who had been managing scarcity for years without anyone's help. "My boys are the same age. You want me to give them less, so yours gets more." Cal Briggs, without looking up from the wall he was leaning against. "Dottie's sick. You don't hear me asking for extra." The room held. Amos looked at the faces around him and found no purchase anywhere. Not agreement, not sympathy, not even the comfortable ambiguity of people who privately agreed, but would not say so. He had brought his argument to a room that had spent a week making collective decisions about collective survival, and the room had reached its own verdict without requiring leadership to deliver it. Wren watched the whole of this. She did not speak during it. When the silence had done what silence could do, she said quietly, "Portions stay equal. If they need to get smaller for everyone, they get smaller for everyone equally. Nobody eats more because they ask for more." Amos sat back down. The flush on his face was the flush of a man who is genuinely angry, but has located no legitimate target for the anger. His son across the chamber appeared not to have heard any of it. That night she heard the knock, not the two-blow knock against the rock face that people used when they arrived at the Juniper. This knock came from the outer side of the passage, a single deliberate impact. Unhurried, the knock of someone who was not desperate, but had decided the time had come. She took the lantern through the passage and pushed through the Juniper into the cold. He was standing 3 feet from the entrance, half visible in the dark. Large boots, a coat that had seen decades of hard weather, a face she had not seen before but recognized in the way you recognize, a thing you have been building a theory about for weeks. The large boot prints, the eastern approach from the ridgeline, the precise utility of every item he had left at the pine tree. He was old, not frail, old, weathered old, the kind of age that accumulates in a person who has spent it outside. 67, perhaps. 70. The lantern caught his eyes, dark, patient, the eyes of a man who was comfortable being looked at. In front of him in the snow he had set 2 large bundles. She could smell them before she identified them. Smoked meat, the dense, rich smell of properly smoked venison. He had also set down a flour sack tied at the top, and a bundle of dried goods she could not itemize in the dark. "You're the one who left the rabbit." It was not a question. "Been watching you work." His voice was the voice of someone who spoke carefully because he had spent time in situations where words needed to carry weight. Didn't want to interrupt. Wren held the lantern up slightly. "You know this cave." He was quiet for a moment, choosing. "I know it the way you know a place you lived for a while and left and never stopped thinking about." The marks on the wall. She watched his face. 14 months. Something moved across his expression, not grief, not quite. The particular look of a man who has made a decision about a thing a long time ago and is encountering the evidence of it unexpectedly. Winter of 69, through to spring of 71, had some trouble, needed somewhere that didn't require me to explain myself. "Why did you stop counting?" His mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was close to it at one corner. "Because the spring came and I remembered I had people I could go back to. When you have people to go back to, you stop counting the days between yourself and them." He looked past her toward the passage entrance. "How many inside?" 12. He looked at the bundles he had brought. He made a calculation she watched him make without knowing the specific numbers behind it. Then he bent, lifted the larger bundle, held it out. "This'll stretch 4 days if you're careful. Dried corn in the sack. The rest is smoked venison. I've been running lines on the upper ridge since the storm started. Figured somebody would need it." She took the bundle. It was heavy in the way food is heavy when you have been managing the absence of it carefully. She looked at him. "Who are you?" "Reuben Strand." He said it the way a man says his name when he has been without anyone to say it to for some time. Not performed, not abbreviated, just the full sound of it, given its due. "I run trap lines on the upper Ashen Creek drainage. Been doing it for 20 years. The dried corn will cook faster than the venison." He picked up the flour sack, held it out. "Use the corn first." She took the flour sack. She looked at the man who had been watching her work for weeks, who had left the rabbit, the hatchet, the rope, the deer hide, who had been moving along the upper ridge while the worst storm in memory buried the valley below. "You could have come in sooner." "Didn't want to." He held her gaze steadily. "You were doing fine. A person doing fine doesn't need company. They need the thing they're about to run out of." He nodded at the bundles. "Now you have it." He turned to go. She stopped him with his name. He turned back. "The last mark on the wall. It stops mid-row." She watched his face. "What happened that day?" He was quiet for a long time. The snow fell lightly between them, the last of the storm giving itself up in small increments. "Nothing happened. That was the point. I woke up, made the fire, went to the wall, got the knife out, put it back." He looked at the rock face above the juniper. "Some mornings, you just know you're done with one thing and ready for the next. Didn't need to mark it. The stopping was enough." He walked east into the dark along the ridgeline route she now recognized and was gone before she could watch him fully disappear. She brought the food inside. She did not explain where it came from. She set it on the shelf. Noted the adjustment to the inventory out loud, for the room watched the recalculation move across 12 faces in the firelight. 4 more days of food. Cal Briggs looked at the venison, and his shoulders dropped from the position they had held for days, a physical release of a tension that had been structural. Lorna Gould turned toward the wall for a moment, not crying, just taking a second away from the room to hold something privately. Marta Selby looked at Wren with the level gaze of a woman doing her own accounting. She did not ask where it came from. She said, "I'll start on the corn in the morning." The storm ended on the 8th day. Not with drama, the wind simply was not there when Wren woke. She lay still for a moment, waiting for the next gust, and it did not come. The silence was the real silence. The silence after something rather than the false silence between gusts, and it had a quality to it that she felt in her chest before she was fully upright. She went through the passage. The juniper was half buried in drift. She pushed through it and stood on the hillside in the stillness. The sky was white and pale and completely empty of weather. The valley below was transformed, not destroyed, though, from up here. It looked close to that, the depth of the snow cover erasing every familiar surface grade, every road, every fence line. But the light on it was the light of a clear, cold morning in Wyoming. The particular quality of winter light after a storm, sharp-edged, honest, showing everything exactly as it was. She went back inside. "We're going down," she said to the chamber. They moved in stages. Marta's sons went first to clear the worst of the path using the 2 spare boards from the shelf construction as rough shovels. Then the family with the infant, then the others in the order of their ability to manage the slope. Wren went last with Opal beside her. The old woman was mobile, stiff, but mobile, her jaw set against the cold, with the expression of someone who considers showing difficulty to be a form of complaining. The descent took an hour. The snow was deep enough on the open hillside to require negotiating rather than walking. Stepping high, testing before committing weight, using the rope Wren had strung between trees on the upper section to give people something to hold. Nobody fell. Nobody needed to be carried. They came off the hillside and onto the buried main road of Copperbell in a group of 12, and they stood there in the white silence of a town that was still in the process of understanding what had happened to it. The damage was real. 2 roofs had collapsed under the snow load. The east road was buried past the eaves of the houses that fronted it. Fences were gone. A barn at the south end of the valley had lost its front wall entirely. But there were people outdoors, opening, the sounds of shoveling beginning somewhere on the far side of town, a horse calling from the direction of the livery. Copperbell was hurt, but not dead. Amos Greer, standing in the main road with snow to his hips, looked at his house, its roof intact, its chimney unbroken, and then looked at Wren with an expression that had no precedent in his previous dealings with her. Something had been rearranged in the man, reorganized by 8 days in a cave, by a room that had declined to follow him into selfishness, by the specific experience of being kept alive, by the preparations of a person he had publicly dismissed. He did not have a speech. He did not attempt one. He looked at her for a long moment, and then with the deliberate movement of a man performing an action he has decided on rather than one that happens to him, he nodded. A full nod. The kind that means something. Emmett Gould's warehouses were their next destination, not because anyone organized it. The crowd simply moved that direction, 12 from Stone Cradle, and others emerging from houses along the road, converging by the logic of a town that had survived a disaster and was now assessing what had been withheld from it. Emmett was already outside his store when they arrived, standing on the swept section of boardwalk in front of his door, wearing his good coat, his large hands at his sides. He had swept the boardwalk. That was the first thing Wren noticed. He had been out here long enough to clear the snow from 6 feet of wooden walkway, which meant he had seen them coming down the hill. The crowd gathered in the road. It was not a mob. There was no shouting, no forward press. It was quieter than that. The quiet of people who have survived something together and are now looking at the man who chose not to. Silas Mott came from the direction of the forge. He had cleared a path from his building to the road, and he walked it now with the unhurried step of a man who has decided what he is going to do. He came to the front of the group and stood in the road before Emmett's boardwalk and said what he had come to say without ceremony. I laughed at that girl, laughed when she told us what was coming, stood right there in Bess's diner and treated her like a fool. He did not look at Wren. He was looking at Emmett. I was wrong about the storm about her. Been wrong before. I can live with being wrong. He paused, and in the pause, the cold air held everything still. What's your answer, Emmett? Emmett Gould stood on a swept boardwalk and looked at the crowd. Wren watched him run the calculation one final time. She could see it in his face, the familiar motion of a man whose first response to any situation was to find the numbers in it. She had seen that calculation run before on a different man at a different table in a different October. She knew what it looked like when it finished. Then Emmett looked at Lorna. His daughter stood at the edge of the group, still in the coat she had arrived in at the Juniper on the 5th night of the storm, 8 days of cave life, written on her face not as suffering, but as the particular quality of someone who has been tested at close range and had not broken. Emmett looked at her the way a father looks at a child who has become something other than the version he had been managing. Not rejection, not pride exactly. Something in between those things that had no clean name. Lorna looked back at him. She did not move toward him. She did not speak. She simply held his gaze with a steadiness that was entirely her own, located in the 8 days of Stone Cradle, in the decision she had made on the morning she could not stay. Emmett's jaw moved once. Then he reached into his coat pocket, produced a key ring, selected a key, stepped off the boardwalk into the snow, walked to the warehouse door on the left, and put the key in the lock. The door opened. The inside of the warehouse was exactly what Lorna had described, organized full the goods stacked with the same precision Emmett brought to everything. Flour, salt, pork, beans, preserved vegetables, cornmeal, tobacco, lamp oil, rope. Enough for 2 winters. He had told them that in the diner. He had been telling the truth. Nobody rushed in. The crowd looked at what was in the warehouse, then back at Emmett, with the restraint of people who have survived on careful portions for 8 days and had not lost the habit. Marta Selby's voice came from somewhere in the group, practical and direct. What terms? Emmett looked at her. He looked at Silas. He looked at Lorna one more time, standing at the edge of the group with her own kind of stillness. No terms. His voice was quiet enough that the people at the back of the crowd leaned forward slightly to catch it. Take what the families need. It was on the walk back from the warehouse, while the crowd dispersed into the work of distribution and shoveling and the enormous project of putting a buried town back into function, that Wren came face to face with Denton Harp on the main road. He was shoveling the path from the house to the road with the methodical efficiency he brought to all physical tasks. He saw her coming. He stopped shoveling. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and held something out in the flat of his palm. It was the paper, the table of numbers. But it had been torn, not in anger, not jagged, but once cleanly down the center fold line. 2 halves of a column of figures that had determined her life in October. She looked at the 2 pieces of paper in his hand. She thought about what she wanted from Denton Harp, and whether an apology from a man like Denton would mean anything that his arithmetic had not already failed to mean. She thought about the difference between what she had wanted in October standing in his kitchen with the paper in her hand and what she understood now in February, having carried 12 people through 8 days of a Wyoming blizzard. She took the two halves from his palm. The numbers were right. They had always been right. The numbers were just not the only thing that was true. She put the two pieces in her coat pocket. Denton picked up his shovel. He went back to work. She walked on. Cora was waiting at the end of the road. Not at the house at the end of the road itself, standing in the snow that had been partially cleared by the morning's traffic. Her coat buttoned wrong, her hair pulled back but not secured properly, the wind having worked pieces of it across her face. She had come out of the yard and walked to the road and stopped there at the boundary between the property and the town, as if she had gotten as far as she could go and was waiting to see if that was far enough. She looked like herself, which was to say she looked like a woman who contained more than she was usually able to say, and who had been containing it for 8 days without a place to put it. I came out every morning. Cora's voice was not controlled. This time it had the quality of a voice that has been controlled for weeks and has finally used up the supply. Every morning while the storm was on, stood at the road and looked at the hill. Wren waited. I packed that bag before the paper. The wind moved between them light now, the last of the weather. Not after, before. I need you to know I understood what he was going to do before he did it, and I packed the bag instead of telling him no. Her eyes were direct. Cora's eyes, when she was not managing them, were her daughter's eyes, the same gray, the same attention. That is the worst thing I have ever done. I have known that every day since October. Wren looked at her mother. She thought about the wooden spoon. She thought about the shoulders. She thought about the bag behind the winter box. The dried apple measured out the flour in its cloth sack. The coat folded carefully. Love expressed as preparation for departure because preparation was what Cora had instead of courage in October. She also thought about what Reuben Strand had said at the mouth of the cave in the last light of the storm. When you have people to go back to, you stop counting the days. She was not ready to say she had forgiven her mother. Forgiveness was a thing that took time to be true rather than just spoken. But she understood her mother in a way she had not understood her in October, because she now understood something about the difference between courage and preparation, about the things people do when they cannot do the harder thing, about the way love sometimes arrives in the form of what someone could manage rather than what the situation required. She reached out. She took her mother's hand. She held it in the Wyoming cold on the main road of Copperbell, not pulling her closer, not pushing her away. Just holding on, the way you hold something you are not ready to put down, which is different from the way you hold something you are certain you will keep. They stood there for a moment. Then Wren let go. She walked north toward the hill toward Stone Cradle. The community meeting happened 3 days later in Bess Holloway's diner, which was the largest enclosed space in Copperbell, capable of holding the number of people who needed to be in the same room. Bess made coffee. People sat on benches dragged from the church on the supply counter on the floor. The conversation was specific, practical Wyoming, not a testimony meeting or a session of remorse. It was people going through what went wrong with the intention of not repeating it. Amos Greer spoke about the stove that had failed, about the inadequacy of his preparation, about what he would change. Several others did the same. Near the end of it, someone suggested naming the cave. Stone Cradle, the name Wren had been using privately, had apparently spread through the group without her mentioning it. The suggestion came to formalize it, to designate it on whatever map Copperbell maintained to keep it stocked as a community resource. Then came the other suggestion, name it for her. She was sitting near the back wall, a coffee cup she had not drunk from cooling in her hands. She felt the room turn toward her, felt the weight of what the room was offering. Not just a name, a permanent acknowledgement, the kind of public inscription that meant something in a small town where names on things outlasted the people they honored. She set the coffee cup down. Name it Stone Cradle. Her voice carried across the room without needing to be raised. The cave doesn't belong to me. I borrowed it from the person before me, and whoever comes after will borrow it from us. What it's called should say what it is, not who used it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Silas Mott, from his position near the window, said, Stone Cradle. Just repeating it, the way you repeat a name to hear whether it sits right. It sat right. The meeting ended with practical agreements, a rotating community responsibility for maintaining the Stone Cradle stock, a minimum inventory, to be held there at all times through the cold months, a method for tracking use. Marta Selby volunteered to organize the first rotation. Two of the farmers offered firewood. Aldous Fenn, without being asked, offered to donate from his supply store's inventory at cost, rather than profit for the first stocking of the season. Emmett Gould sat in the corner and did not speak during any of this. Lorna sat across the room from him. At one point, their eyes met briefly. Neither looked away in anger. They looked at each other the way two people look at each other when they have a long way to go before they know where they will end up, but have acknowledged at minimum that the other person exists. In the first week of March, the warmth came, not warmth exactly. Wyoming in early March is never warm, but the specific quality of sunlight returning to an angle that reminded the landscape of what it was supposed to be doing. Snow began moving. The creek reappeared in sections. The mountains lost a degree of their severity. On a Tuesday morning, Wren climbed back to Stone Cradle alone. The path was clear enough now to walk without the rope. The juniper had shed its snow load. Inside the cave held the last of the supplies the community had brought up after the storm replacement stocks already positioned the shelves refilled. The main pit had been cleaned. The deflection wall had been mortared properly by one of the farmers with actual mortar. The clay and pine needle patch she had done with her hands, upgraded to something that would last. She stood in the center of the chamber and looked at it. It was the same cave. The ceiling was the same height. The fire pit had the same blackened stones around its rim. The marks on the far wall were exactly where they had been since before she arrived, 14 months of Reuben Strand's careful daily accounting, ending in the single unfinished line. She crossed to the wall. She looked at that last mark for a long time. The line he had made and then decided was sufficient. She pulled her knife from her coat. She pressed the tip to the rock just to the right of Reuben's final line. She made one vertical mark. Clean, deliberate, the same depth he used. One line beside his. Not to count the days. Not to record the weeks. Not to measure the length of what she had endured. She stepped back from the wall. The two marks stood side by side, his last, her first, separated by 13 years of other people's seasons, and the same stone wall that had neither forgotten anything nor been required to. She put the knife away. She looked around the chamber one more time at the stocked shelves, the clean pit, the mortared wall, the high ceiling, the passage entrance with its winter-proof clay. Then she walked out through the passage, pushed through the juniper, stood on the hillside. The valley below her was beginning to show its own colors again. The brown of exposed earth, where the snow had retreated, the dark line of the creek running where it always ran, the smoke from chimneys in Copperbell rising straight up in the cold, still morning. People were moving on the main road, small figures too distant to identify going about the ordinary business of a morning in a town that was like every place that survived something, both what it had been before and no longer exactly that. She heard a sound at the tree line. She turned. Boot prints in the remaining snow at the edge of the trees, large with the inward angle of someone accustomed to uneven ground. Coming from the east, stopping, turning back. Fresh from this morning, the edges still sharp. No gift left this time. No rabbit, no rope, no dry hide. Just the prints. Just the evidence of a person who had come to see how it stood and had turned back satisfied. Wren looked at the boot prints for a long moment. Then she turned back to the valley. Below her, Copperbell was going about its morning. The ordinary world was running itself as it would continue to do. The difference was that this time, standing on the hillside above it, she was not watching it from outside. She was part of it now, not because it had accepted her, though it had, but because she had accepted it, the whole complicated arrangement of it, the people who had laughed, the people who had come through the passage in the dark, the people who still had a long way to go before they knew where they would end up. She was not thinking about survival. She was thinking about tomorrow, which is the only luxury available to a person who has already handled today. She stood on the hillside above Ashen Creek while Stone Cradle waited behind her, stocked, ready, its door open for whatever season came next, and the last of the winter light spread across the Wyoming hills with the particular honesty of a sky that has nothing left to withhold.